Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Lunch and Learn. Hooray! And buenos dias to all of our international viewers as well. Welcome to every single one of you, to all those watching on Zoom, and to all those watching on Facebook and YouTube, and imprinted onto your eyeballs. Wherever you're seeing us around the world, it is wonderful to have you here to the millions. Okay, enough of that, Rabbi Nick. So we're going to talk first about Parashat Pinchas, and then we will go on to revisit the Mishnayot that we were talking about last week in Pirkei Avot. So a couple of things about Parashat Pinchas. The story picks up where we left off last week. Last week in Parashat Balak, we'd read the episode of the King Balak who employed the prophet Bilam to go and curse the Jewish people, and after that whole episode, there was a situation where the Midianites were trying to seduce the Jewish men, and as a result of that, Pinchas had stood up at the end of last week's parasha and had gone and zealously protected God's honor and the honor of the Jewish people, and he had killed two individuals. And we continue that story this week, where Hashem actually rewards Pinchas for his zealotry, and he is rewarded that the the role of Kohanim, of priesthood, will continue to flow through his descendants. He's given a covenant of peace as well, and we also learn of the names of the individuals who were slain last week. There was Zimri from the tribe of Shimon, and there was Cosbi, who was the lady from the Midianite nation, who had been inappropriately intimate with each other, and that had provoked Pinchas's zealotry. So that's the beginning of this week's parsha. It then goes on to take a census of the Jewish people again, because in last week's parsha there was a plague which wiped out some people, and so there's another census in this week's parsha where the numbers of the Jewish nation are counted again. And then we move on to a very famous story about the daughters of Slofchad. Slofchad is somebody who came out of Mitzrayim. He had 5 daughters and no sons, and he died. And when it was coming time for the land of Israel to be divided up amongst all of the different tribal families, the daughters of Slofchad came to Moshe and complained and protested and said, "This is not fair. We are not going to end up with an allocated portion in the land of Israel, because the inheritance is all going through the male side. So our whole family link and our whole family's rights to a plot in the land of Israel is going to be lost because there are no male inheritors." And so Moshe was unsure what to do in this situation, so he consulted Hashem. We should never be afraid to admit when we don't know. We should never be afraid to ask questions if we need sage advice. And so Moshe Rabbeinu asked Hashem what the halacha should be, what the situation should be, and lo and behold, Hashem answers and says that the 5 daughters of Tzlachad should receive a portion in the land of Israel, and that in that way protects them going forward. And then the rest of the parasha in the main. Oh, there's one other bit, which is Moshe asking for a successor to be named for when he leaves the world. And it's none other than Yehoshua bin Nun, who is appointed, who is designated to be the leader of the Jewish people when Moshe will eventually leave the world. And then the last chunk of this week's parsha are the portions talking about Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, the different festivals, and the different sacrifices that would need to be brought on each of those occasions. And these are the passages that we actually read on the different Yom Tovs and Rosh Chodesh. So that all comes up in this week's Parsha. Any comments or questions before we dive into Pirkei Avot? Rita's not on, so I guess there's no comments or questions. In that case, that is a very good and astute point. And I'm sure there's lots to say on Pinchas and why he did what he did and what motivated him and all the rest of it. But you're only 21 though, Martin. 100%. That's right. It says that verse 8. Vayavo acha ish Yisrael el hakubah, that he followed him into the tent and pierced them both with his spear. But the promiscuity that was going on and the seducing and the attempts to cause that betrayal from the Jews, that was happening in public in a sense. They had the I think it's Midrash that talks about they had old ladies outside trying to sell different items, and then when that captivated the attention of the men, they would say, "Oh, if you think this merchandise is good, come and have a look inside here, and we'll show you where the best merchandise is." And that's where they had apparently these Midianite women ready to seduce the men. Yeah, yeah. Well, we're a long way off from getting to it in the bigger picture, but hopefully we'll get there someday. Okay, Pirkei Avos. Here we go. Let's get it on the screen for us over here. So let's just refresh our memories. Do we want to do this with someone reading, or do you want me to read? I'll read it. Okay. So last week we went through essentially two lengthy Mishnayos, and we talked about them in depth. And now we're going to try and grapple with it a bit more and wrap our heads around it. So we said 7 types of punishment come to the world for 7 kinds of transgressions. And we said, number 1, if some people tithe and others do not, a famine caused by lack of rain ensues. Some go hungry and some are satisfied. So we said, if there is a pick and choose, as it were, of people that follow these rules, then there will be a pick and choose way of the world responding to that. And some will go hungry and some will suffer and some will not. If there was a societal decision not to tithe, if all decided not to tithe, then the world reacts with a general famine. If it's indiscriminate, then the world reacts indiscriminately. If they also decided not to separate challah, a famine caused by fatal drought ensues. And we said the decision as a society not to take challah, not to even allocate a small piece for other people, means that the punishment will be even more severe. Because if you can't even give a tiny, 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 tiny portion, then the world reacts in a harsher way. And then we moved into one in my book is Mishnah 11, and we said Dever Bala Olam, pestilence comes to the world for death penalties that should have been administered and were not carried out by the court. That was one reason. And for the illegal use of fruits of the Shemitah, for not for not following those rules. So we said that if we have a sympathy and a tolerance for wrongdoing, and we are unwilling to distinguish between right and wrong, and if we equalize everyone, be it a terrorist, be it an innocent victim, everyone's the same. So then the world reacts with a consequence, a punishment, which doesn't distinguish between right and wrong, between good and bad, between old and young, between male and female, between innocent and guilty. The world responds in kind, midah keneged midah. And we said that if we refuse to acknowledge with Shemitah that Hashem is in charge of the world and Hashem controls the world and it's Hashem who gives us the food that we eat, then the result of that is that something comes to the world which just shows how powerful and how in control Hashem really is. So that was number 4. Number 5, we said the sword of war comes to the world for the delay of justice, for the perversion of justice, and for rendering decisions contrary to the halacha. Am I in the right? Yeah, I'm still in the right place. And we'd said over there that the side effect of overthrowing the 3 foundations of the world, of justice, truth, and peace, brings cherev, chorban, brings destruction to the world. And that was the next thing. If we undermine justice, if we undermine truth, and we undermine peace, then the result is that the world just goes to pot and everybody fights and is in conflict with one another. And also the 4th one there, for rendering decisions contrary to the halacha. So the next one, which is number 6, wild beasts. Down here, wild beasts come to the world on account of vain oaths and chilul Hashem, desecration of God's name. And we'd said that once you start to push God out of our lives, so that can unleash wild forces within society. And then we'd said the final one, exile comes to the world for idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed, for the 3 big cardinal sins. And we mentioned the Baal Shem Tov, which says that these 3 cardinal mistakes, these 3 cardinal sins, bring about exile. And we said, well, what's so bad about exile? And the Baal Shem Tov said that exile is the worst of all the punishments, because to not know who you are, to forget who you are, that is the worst punishment that you can go through. To live your life blissfully unaware that things could be better is a bad place to be. And the other cause of exile, the Mishnah said, is working the earth during the sabbatical year. So that was the 2 Mishnayot, and we've had a couple of questions that I took down last week, which we'll go through. So I'm going to start with those first, and then we can turn to other questions as well. We said it was a lot to swallow. There's a lot going on, so let's see what we can do. The first question that we'll tackle is, who wrote this Mishnah, and where is he coming from? All right, do you remember that question being asked? Indeed, good. So who wrote this Mishnah, and where is he coming from? So the person who compiled and composed this Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. He was the compiler of all the Mishnayot, all of the 63 Masechtas, all of the 63 books of the Mishnah, which fall into the 6 volumes, are compiled by one person, by Rabbi Judah the Prince. He is not the spokesman, as it were, of this Mishnah. There is no spokesman in this Mishnah, right? On other occasions, we've had Hillel, we've had Shammai, we've had Rabbi Yochanan, we've had all these different rabbis who have said, this is my message to the world. I've got 2 minutes on my soapbox, and this is what I'm going to say. This is the distillation of my life's teachings into these statements. That's not what's going on over here. So what is going on over here? And the answer is, how did Rabbi Judah Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, where did he get his material from? Right? He's compiled from where? So the answer is that all of the rabbis, all of the teachers would have their lecture notes. Yeah, they'd have their teaching notes. That doesn't violate what was a problem of writing down the oral law, right? That's not what they were doing. They were writing down their notes so that they could teach the oral law and remember what to say about the oral law. They were not compiling as a set text for the Jewish nation the oral law. Okay? But when it came time in history, as I think we've mentioned before, that Rabbi Judah the Prince said, we either write this down or we lose it forever, as the Jews were being more and more dispersed around the world and finding it harder and harder to transmit those messages. So Rabbi Judah the Prince took the decision that he was going to compile these statements, these notes, these lecture notes, and he was going to put them into something which he called the Mishnah, the 6 books of the Mishnah. Okay, so Rabbi Judah is compiling this, and what he has found here is what is known as a Mishnah Rishonah. It's an old teaching which has been taught verbally from generation to generation, all the way back to Moshe. So that's who has brought this Mishnah to our attention. This will have been a lesson that will have been taught, and it will have been taught in classrooms for generations before him, all tracing all the way back to the lessons and the teachings that Moshe received from Mount Sinai, from Hashem and Mount Sinai. That was our first Mishnah all the way back at the beginning, that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, he transmitted it to Joshua, and so on and so forth. That was what we literally read about 331 pages ago in this book. That he transmitted it to Joshua, to the elders, to the prophets, to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, to the men of the Great Assembly. That was a transmission. This is part of the transmission as well. So this is not some revolutionary theory that he just concocted. This is Masorah. This is Kabbalah. This is a received lesson that traces all the way back to Mount Sinai. So that is who wrote it. And as for where he's coming from, well, he wasn't coming from anywhere. He is just faithfully transcribing a teaching that goes back to Mount Sinai. Now, I appreciate that will still leave us with other questions, but before we come to those, I'm going to turn to the third question that I was asked, which is, how is this a fair system? Right? How is this a fair system? And I believe the thrust of this question was that what we're seeing is, on account of some individuals doing things the way they shouldn't be doing them, many other people will suffer. There's a collateral damage. Is that right? Is that a fair way of representing this question? Right? Yeah. So go on. It's like the old metaphor, the old analogy of the guy on the boat, and he's drilling a hole under his seat, and everyone's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he's like, "What? It's my seat. I'm just drilling a hole under my seat." They're like, "But you're going to flood the whole ship." No, don't be silly. This is just my area. Right? The actions that we do will have an impact on those around us, and we understand that on a physical level. Yeah. So I'm going to turn to Joy in just a second. I'm just going to leave with one sentence here, which is that we understand this on a physical level very, very easily. We understand that if I drill a hole in a boat, I flood the boat for everyone. We understand that if I pump poisonous fumes into the atmosphere, I can ruin the world for everybody. We understand this on a physical basis, but we never talk about the spiritual way in which this works. And so to see these Mishnayot will probably be very, very difficult. So because collectively we didn't do a particular mitzvah or we didn't behave in a particular way, as a result of that, spiritually something happens which translates into physical consequences and physical punishments. And we don't really understand how that cause and effect is working. And we don't understand necessarily why so many people will suffer. Right? If I do something physical, I can understand that it's going to have a physical reaction, but we're talking about spiritual um, causes and effects over here. So I'm going to turn to Joy, and then we'll come back to that. Oh, yay! Nothing of any benefit, Joy. Nothing of. I would say 100% yes, and and there is a responsibility, and the Torah talks about it quite openly, about that responsibility. And there's a whole there are two parshiot in the Torah which talk about the really negative cause and effects of not doing the right thing. One as a society level and one as an individual level. Um, and it's there in black and white, but we don't necessarily talk about it much. We don't necessarily relate to it much, and we don't necessarily heed it enough. But the Torah is clear. The things that we do have an impact on the world, and it's not going to be a particularly popular thing to say, and all of the rest of it. And it requires still more study and more understanding about what that means, because it's not a great thing to say, is it? When you've got people in the world saying that the Jews run the world, right? And then we're saying like literally the actions that we do have the ability to influence the entire world. Um, but it's supposed to be a call to arms, as it were, a challenge for the Jewish people to set the right example, to be the Or Lagoyim, to be the light unto the nations, because there's a lot riding them. Um, so fundamentally, it does nothing to help with the point after that, right? That still raises other questions, but fundamentally, you asked a question: do the Jews are we supposed to lead by example? Are we supposed to be behaving this way because our actions have consequences? Yes, that is the answer to your question, and that's what we see from this mission as well. Um, After that point, that opens up a whole load of other questions. Um, but yeah, one step at a time. The got this book here called Derech Hashem, the Path of God, written by Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal. Lived in Italy in the 1700s, 1500s. I can't remember exactly when. And it's a very systemized, structured book talking about the way the world works. And it's difficult to understand, and it's deep, while at the same time being very orderly and well thought out. And one of the things that he says is that you've got the spiritual world. One second. Why does mine look 3 times bigger than yours? Oh, right. Why does my book look 3 times bigger than yours? Because this is a special version with different commentaries, and it's line by line translated into English. Yes, you do want it. You most certainly want this version. Go and buy it immediately on it. So back to the book. So I don't understand everything that it says, but broadly speaking, there's spirituality which cannot be measured, and it cannot be defined, and it's very difficult to understand, and it's not physicality. And then there's the physical world, which we can understand empirically, scientifically, mathematically, biologically. We can understand the physical world around us. It's very complex, very detailed, but we can understand it. The spiritual world, we can't understand it necessarily, because we can't see it. We can't touch it. It's not tangible. But what the Ramchal tells us is that, by and large, there are things that happen in the spiritual world which impact their physical counterparts. What that means, long time to learn about it and to explain it and to understand it. Broadly speaking, the spiritual world, different things happen, and that has an effect on the physical world. That translates into something in the physical world. He talks about how everything physical has a spiritual counterpart, almost has someone in charge of it. The Gemara, the Talmud talks about how there is an angel over each and every single blade of grass telling it to grow. All right, what that means, again, big stuff. But that's essentially what we're talking about. There is something happening spiritually which makes something happen physically in the world. We are connected through a chain, the physical world and the spiritual world. Everything has its counterpart. The exception to the way in this system works is with mankind and with free will. Right? There's not something up there that's pulling the strings and then making us do what we're doing. When we do something, we tug on the cord, and that means that something up in the spiritual world moves around, and on account of something in the spiritual world moving around, that then sends movement back down in the physical world. All right, so we're connected, but I don't know what that means. Just unmute yourself, Yanir, and ask your questions. Don't just. So, I see. He's sending them to me privately. But so when mankind pulls on the strings down here through our actions, we send a shockwave up to the spiritual world, which has a knock-on effect, which means that down here again, something gets affected and something gets impacted. That is the briefest, concisest, probably does not capture any of the essence of what we need to know. But that's something that the Ramchal talks about. The things that we do in this world have an impact on the world. We pull a string, it sends a message up there, things move around, and that has a knock-on effect to the physical world. Is it fair? Well, it's clearly measured. That's what the mission is telling us. Midah keneged midah. If we pull enough strings, right, then it's going to make a big shift into what happens in this world, and it's a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard truth, and it's something that we need to spend a lot of time. Pardon me, sorry. Okay, let's refine it. Hmm. Or put a slightly other way. He doesn't have our attribute of fairness. It's subjective. I think it's an excellent point that you made so far, though. Um, talk me through that. You're talking about Tuesday night when Rabbi Friedman was interviewing Rabbi Feld or discussing with Rabbi Feld. So Those are your words, though, not Rabbi Sachs's words. Those are your words, not Rabbi Sachs's words. Okay. No, no. Everything that you say really, in many ways, all connects, and I agree with you. Um, I th these are fundamental things, and but I think the right place to address them is in our Torah study rather than our prayer. You know, we could we wake up every morning and we make blessings before we start to pray. And there are some pieces from the Mishnah that we read, and we say Elu Dvarim. Um, let's just get the words. Elu Dvarim Sha'adam ochel perotehem ba'olam hazeh va'keren kayemet lo'olam haba. We say these are the things that a person eats the fruit of, in the sense that they're important things to take care of and to do in this world, but the principal reward remains in the world to come. And then it lists them honoring parents, doing acts of kindness, getting up to study, going to daven, hosting, hospitality, visiting the sick, etc., etc. Right, and it says that Torah study is equal, if not exceeds, the reward and the benefit of all of these things. Um, that's the only bit of Talmud really that we have in our prayer service. The prayer service is not Mishnah, it's not Gemara. So but that's why we have to, that's why the Jewish law says we should carve out time every day to study, right? You do that, you carve out time, right? I'm sure there's other occasions, but you carve out 12 o'clock till 1 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon to study Torah. And because you do that, you get exposed to ideas, and you get exposed to depth, and you get exposed to breadth, right? Which allows you and gives you access to these kinds of things. But most people, or a lot of people, don't do that. They don't carve out time. If you don't carve out time, you can't expect to see everything. It's the same with davening as well. If you don't carve out time to actually figure out how to learn Hebrew, how to read Hebrew, how to understand Hebrew, right, then the 40-minute service, or the hour service, or the 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, you're not going to get everything that it has to offer. Um, it's not appropriate to stand up for 10, 15 minutes on a Shabbos morning, and for the first thing that comes out of your mouth is, guys, if you don't do this, you're going to burn in hell. It's that the fire and brimstone approach used to be a way that ministers, rabbis, teachers, that they used to try and engage with their audience, and people got burnt. People got burned. It wasn't an effective way of interacting. We also need to teach people how to do what they're doing out of a place of love, not just out of a place of fear. Um, something like this can get a person um, to come at things from a place of fear. Like, oh, boy, if I don't do this, and this is going to happen. It's an important part of our Jewish journey and our connection to God, but it's one that isn't really such an effective tool anymore. And so people do need to learn this, and people do need to hear it, and it is a part of Judaism, and it's all authentic Torah. But you have to be careful not to alienate the audience, which is something that Rabbi Sachs most certainly did identify with. He would always try not to say things that would alienate the audience, alienate the people that he was talking to, because if you cut that off, then people won't come back, and that's the conversation finished. This is a different format. This is a different forum where we are all willing to at least be exposed to these things, and to be able to talk about it, and to digest it as we wish to digest it. But yeah, it's not the type of thing that needs to be rewritten or swept under the carpet, or whatever. We took on a commitment to see what Pirkei Avot had to say. We've come to these two Mishnayot. We have read these two Mishnayot. We have explored these two Mishnayot. It opens up many questions. It opens up many doors. But we can't just say like, oh, he should have rewritten it. It's a hard thing for us to see, and it should be censored or sanitized. No, but you were saying like he should have rewritten it for his time. But what he is doing is sharing with us the words that, yeah, it wasn't written in his time. He transcribed it in his time, but what we were saying is that he is taking words that have been taught faithfully, word for word, verbally, for generations since Mount Sinai. It's not his opinion. It's not his statement. It's not his standing on the soapbox and distilling his wisdom. That's what we've been doing. But why shouldn't it be? Why shouldn't it be? Why shouldn't it be difficult? Why shouldn't we want everything to be easily. Yeah. Joy? How many good people does it take to change a light bulb? Um, the answer is fundamentally, I don't know. We've had a guarantee. We've had a guarantee, which we talked about from Parashat Noah. We've had a guarantee that the world will not descend to a point of everybody being so beyond despair that he has to flood the world like he did in the episode in Parashat Noah. So there are always going to be good people in the world, and if every single one of us was to take it upon ourselves to try and be one of those good people, then there'd be a lot of good people in the world. We have to start with ourselves and be the best people that we can be, and we have to hope that that good example influences people around us. And if it influences people around us, then more people will want to be like us. And if more people want to be like us, then they will improve themselves, and that will have an influence on everybody else. It's the way viral marketing works. We just need to market ourselves in the best way that we can do, in the hope that inspires others to match like for like, really. And we'll do that in our own ways. That's not saying that everybody has to do this and everybody has to do that. Every single person's soul's journey will light up in different ways from doing different things, and we're supposed to find those areas that we can excel in, and that we can be the best that we can be, and that will have a spiral effect. Um, yeah, yeah. But we will also often find ourselves, as a result of that, being countercultural and counter societal. Um, the things that we may have to do may not be the things that society preaches, or society encourages. They may be getting it wrong. I think one of the hardest things about being a modern Jew is to be able to look at things around us and say, "Hey, that actually is not correct." And I don't want to align myself with that particular thing, because I genuinely don't see how it's advantageous, how it's beneficial, how it's good for me, how it's good for my family, how it's good for society. And I think that's one of the hardest things about being a modern Jew, um, where the world says one thing, and we look at it and we think, sorry, what is no one stopping to ask why? You know, one example that I often think about, because it's one of the biggest that I've talked to my parents about, when they were raising me. And I think I've mentioned it before. Our decision to not just have unfiltered access for our children to watch television and surf the internet, right? My parents didn't have restrictions for me when I was my age, right? But I said to my mum years ago, I said, I could almost guarantee it. If you were raising me in this generation, I think you'd have all of the filters on, and I think you'd have all the parental controls on, um, because the values and the way in which you would not want me to be led by, from TV, social media, internet, whatever it is, I think that your parenting um, targets, as it were, would have translated into um, restrictions and parental controls in my generation. They just didn't exist. There were four channels when I was young, then five. Then there was Sky and cable and whatever. And like these things grew, and they tried to move with it. Um, but there will be parenting styles now where it's just like, I'll just let them be exposed to anything. I'll just let them watch anything. I won't check it first. I'll let them read anything, and and that's because as a society we're just like, yeah, go for it. Everyone can be whatever they want. We can do whatever we want, expose ourselves to whatever we want. But actually, a Jew, anybody really, but as Jews, we find ourselves in situations where we look at something and say, why is society moving like this? Why do I have to just take it as a given because this is what everyone else does? If I stop and I think, I may actually come to a different conclusion, and that's okay. But we're afraid to do that. It sure does. It sure does. And will there be overlaps in what we're referring to and with what they're struggling with? I'm sure there are. I don't know enough about it, but um, you know, it's a hard journey for everyone, and we're all going to have areas in our own lives where um, we have to we have to address it. I know people who um, they felt they were becoming more and more uncomfortable when they were hosting people on Shabbat or hosting people in their home, and conversations would go in particular directions. And societally, it's all okay. Why shouldn't we talk about those things round the table? But they took a step back and they said, actually, that's really hard for us. We don't actually enjoy that level of gossip, that level of whatever. Societally, it's okay. Societally, we destroy people's careers and we cancel people, you know. But actually, if these people were standing there and they were looking at the way society was moving and they were saying, why does it have to be? Why do I have to buy into that just because that's what everybody else is doing? We are the Ivrim. Avraham HaIvri, he stood on one side of the world and the whole of the west of the world stood on the other side. He was espousing a way of life that ran completely counter to the society around him. And that doesn't sit comfortably with a lot of people. But actually, it's one of the most important things that we need to do, which is um, to look at the world around us, look at our lives, and see, is this actually consistent with who I want to be and how I want to behave? And do I have the courage and the bravery to say no? Um, so yeah, why shouldn't we see this? It's good. It can be. It can be. Yeah. And it, it's it, it it's so hard to ask these questions and to have these conversations, and that unfortunately is another byproduct of everyone being the same and every opinion, but as long as you think like me, everyone's equal, everyone's opinions are valid, everyone's truth is valid, but as long as you think like me. If you don't, I'll cancel you. you know we have to be able to talk, we have to be able to think, we have to be able to look, we have to be able to discuss. It's important. And well, well, at the very least, we should be able to stand up in our own homes. Um, discussion for another time, perhaps, or for 2 o'clock. We'll let the Sage Current Affairs crew crack that one. Let's just say farewell to everyone on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you all again next time on Lunch and Learn. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful day.